Hello and welcome to Talking Kids and Race. My name is Andrew Grant
Racing
Thomas.
kids.
Talking Race and Kids. I'm all shaken up, people, because there's so many of you out there, which we're very excited about. My name
Yeah.
is Andrew Grant Thomas. I am a co-founder.
And I'm Melissa Giroux, co-founder.
And we are sitting next to each other on a couch, not coincidentally, because we're in fact a couple. And we have children together. Those children, oops.
Oh, can you let us know if you can hear us, folks? Jen, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Good. So we have 9,000 people registered for this webinar, which is way above any other number we've had, which of course is great news. Let me continue by just telling you a little bit about who we are, because we know a lot of you are new to EmbraceRace. What we are is a national nonprofit dedicated to helping parents, guardians, grandparents, teachers, other adults in the lives of children to raise children who are thoughtful, informed, and brave about race, which is to say to raise children who can be and will become the adults that a thriving multiracial democracy needs. And clearly events, not only of the last week, but for really quite some time now, suggest that we have some challenges ahead of us to achieving that. We do that work by creating resources, by building community, so that the adults in the lives of children can play the part that we need to play. And the webinars, this webinar series, Talking Race and Kids, is certainly, perhaps our signature program. So we've done maybe 40 webinars over the last 3 years with topics, and I'll just read you a little list: how children learn about race, racial identity development, raising healthy multiracial children, transracial adoption, pushing back against white nationalism. I mean, a whole range of issues. We've typically done them once a month, but with COVID and the way that race is interwoven with COVID in all sorts of ways, we've really sort of ramped up the production of these webinars. So actually at the end of this week, we will have had, I think, 8 webinars in the previous 10 weeks. And now, of course, the events of, that happened of Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, which of course we'll talk about today, George Floyd in Minneapolis and the protests, which we'll actually have a webinar on Friday, which will look at how do we support Black children and other children of color as these things are happening. Today's webinar with Jen Harvey, whom we're absolutely delighted to have, will focus on, again, the Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper case, and pay a bit more attention to how we raise white children in light of the sorts of issues raised by that encounter and similar encounters. So if you are on our email list, you have already received and will certainly receive more notices about our Friday webinar. Or you can go to our website, EmbraceRace.org, and click the community link in the nav bar. Let me turn it over to Melissa. We're going to get going to introduce Jen, maybe tell you a little bit more about the session, and then we're off.
Okay, yeah. So I wasn't able to get us on Facebook Live. Sorry, this is the truth of just making it happen in our living room as we go. Sometimes it doesn't work, but next time, right? So there are a lot of people who will be watching the recording instead of being on live, which is fine. So we're so excited today to have Jen Harvey on with us, because we have been hearing about Jen for a while before she wrote her book that a lot of you are reading or have read from the comments that you sent in. And we're really excited because we just consider her, a comrade in the work, but we haven't had a chance, to do anything together. So this is sort of a big moment for us. And Jen wrote a great piece that probably many of you have read about the Cooper situation, all the Coopers. And we took this webinar title from her article, How Do I Make Sure I'm Not Raising the Next Amy Cooper? Dr. Jennifer Harvey's work focuses primarily on racial justice and white anti-racism. Her most recent book, Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America, great title, brings her long time experience in multiracial activism to her journey as a parent, and was a Forward Indie Gold winner. There's a lot about her you can read on our site as well, and that you've probably read. We're just really excited to be having the conversation.
She's very impressive. Welcome, Jen.
From Des Moines.
It's great to be with you. Thank you both so much, and for your work as well. I'm so glad we could carve out this time.
Thank you.
Yeah, after such a long day, Jen's been all over the place. So we want to know a little bit more, or tell the people a little bit more about you and how and why you do this work. I mean, how you got into it, why you do this work.
Yeah, you know, this question always means kind of telling a true story that might be made up, because I never know quite what the why is, but the story I can tell that I know is true. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, going to Denver public schools under a busing mandate for desegregation, which means that my elementary school years in particular, most of my friends at school were Black, especially Black girls. And I was a racial minority demographically, because lots of white parents had pulled their kids from the public schools under that mandate, the busing mandate. But by high school, though I was in a multiracial high school, Denver South High School, I noticed that all of my classes were white. I had been racially tracked, which I didn't know that language, but I would look around and I would think about my early friendships and wonder where my friends what happened to them. Didn't have words for that. Separate thread, I was raised in a Christian family and had been taught that God is love. And so went to college thinking I was a committed Christian, God is love, and found the work of James Cone when I started asking questions about why in my school where everyone said God is love, we also were okay driving by homeless men and women on the street, and thought, this is strange. And the short version of that story is that James Cone, who founded Black liberation theology, taught me that a loving God is a God who is a God of justice, because by definition, if you love humanity, you have to love justice. And also taught me that that a God of justice had to identify with Black people because of the state of the country. And so in that moment when I engaged Cone's work, I thought, oh, this explains my growing up experience. I was raised in white supremacy, so went looking to understand God and found, oh, God had something to say about white supremacy. And the final piece of the story, I think, is that I then went thinking in this very audacious, privileged white way, thought, oh, I'll go study with this person in seminary in New York City, which I did do. But when I got there and I found a community of very politically engaged, deeply committed Black and Latino and Native American Christians who would say back to me, okay, this is great. Like, you can be about God is Black and racial justice, but did you notice you're white? Like, what does that mean? And I thought, oh, I don't know what that means. And that was, more than 20 years ago. And so I feel like that community that said to me, you can be about racial justice, but it needs to be different for you. You have a different kind of responsibility, gave me a charge that I had not heard before. And frankly, that I didn't know what to do with for a long time. I just wallowed around in my 20s trying to figure that out. And, but I did. And I've been doing that ever since. And then I became a mom in my late 30s. And after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, found myself in spaces where white adults were saying, but what about our kids? What do they do? And what do we teach them? And I thought, oh, what am I teaching my own kids? And I was teaching my own kids, but I hadn't reflected intentionally on that and learned about what that needed to look like. And so I started reading and thinking and realizing there wasn't that much out there. So that's how the book came to be. And that's how I started more intentionally reflecting on my own practices as a parent. I'm not a childhood psychology. I know nothing about childhood psychology other than what I have learned to try and write the book and do better with my own kids.
No, thank you, Jen. And that's actually the path most of us travel, if we travel it at all, right? It's sort of, what's the best we can do? How do we learn along the way? How do we not pretend to have expertise, but do learn enough to do better and better as we can.
Yes,
So,
a lot of mistakes along the way. A lot of mistakes.
A lot of mistakes. And
a lot of cringeworthy mistakes, but
sure,
and hopefully
still,
not be stopped or too daunted by that. We're having a few people saying they're having audio issues, but most people seem to be hearing us. So it might be on, if you're still having audio issues, let us know.
A headset, if that's better. Oh my God.
I think folks are okay. So let me ask about the title, the choice of the title, which of course is provocative. A lot of people loved it. Some people, thought it was harsh.
Of the article?
Of the article, I'm sorry. But mostly, and as the article itself makes clear, right, it's not just about Amy Cooper. So when, in this work, right, of not raising the next quote unquote Amy Cooper, certainly isn't just about individuals, right, and how this, how some of the challenges we face are manifest in individual behavior. But it seemed like a good point of departure. Can you tell us what do you mean when you say, how not to raise the next Amy Cooper?
Yeah, so in part, I'll be honest, my partner actually said after she read it, I love the piece. I really wish you hadn't used Amy Cooper's name. That felt, so, but I think for me, the point of that article and what I tried to really be clear about is that it's easy for us to see really explicit racism out in the world and immediately go, oh my gosh, that's not me. That's not me. That's not me. And so I wanted to ask that question in part to signal like, well, how do I be sure that's not what's happening, that couldn't show up in my home? Because the reality is white Americans, without explicit anti-racist engagement in our homes, could very easily, any of us and our own children and youth come up in ways that would show up in that way. And so for me, I was trying to sort of own that and not sort of other Amy Cooper, but more signal, are we really sure that's not what is happening in our homes? And I think, and then it was interesting to me later that we learned that it looks like probably Amy Cooper herself was a Democrat voter, right? But, and that didn't surprise me at all, actually. And so I really want to break down some of these, like, oh, it's easy to point at those others over there, but like how does like more equity-minded white parenting also potentially show up in very racist ways that we might not expect? Could any of us be white Amy Cooper, right?
And
right.
And Jen, and really sort of what it means to be a white Amy Cooper, right? So just like Derek Chauvin, the police officer who had his knee on the neck. I mean, obviously that's an extreme manifestation. Yeah. Most of us aren't going to find ourselves in that position. Most police officers, I believe, wouldn't do that. Yes. But when we say it showing up, yeah, it shows up in many ways. Many of them, more routine, less dramatic, but in some ways more pervasive and actually more consequential, right? So, we talk about hiring practices. This will be familiar to people. We talk about, how teachers and students interact, how we talk about segregation, right? Where we choose to live. I just want to offer one quick example because it's so stark and less dramatic, which is we know, for example, that if people are driving and they see someone at a crosswalk, right, waiting to cross, and the identity of the person at the crosswalk, age, race, gender, for example, absolutely shapes how many cars are likely to pass before someone stops to let that person cross, right? It's relatively innocuous, but I use it because it's an example that many of us like, oh, let me think, would I treat, right, an older person differently than a younger person, a Black person differently than a white person, etc.? The answer may well be yes.
Yeah. And the other thing I think that for me is like the Amy Cooper as sort of a symbol in some ways, is that it's both those sort of the way implicit bias affects behavior without sometimes we don't even realize it. But it's also that collectively, so it's like we are all individual selves, but also when we get in shared spaces, we create a collective phenomena that's beyond that. And white culture tends to produce sort of predictable types of behaviors. So for example, people of color talk all the time about white women's tears and how dangerous they are because they shut down, they're a defense mechanism that shuts down conversation when a Black person or a Latinx person or an Asian American person names racism. And all of a sudden everyone goes, oh, we need to attend to the tears of the white woman, right? That's a collective phenomena that shows up when we have spaces where white silence becomes this norm that literally shapes the space. So it's not just me as an individual, but it's like the environment at my workplace becomes a space where those kind of behaviors can manifest by any of us, and they're kind of predictable. White tears, white rage, white vindictiveness, and they come out of, it's like the sum is greater than its individual parts. And so we've got to break white silence in part, yes, to sort of parent our kids differently, become different and constantly ourselves, but also to interrupt the environments where those kind of behaviors are allowed, sort of are fed without us even realizing it, and then become like, it's predictable, right? For lots of people of color, that Amy Cooper video was a predictable response. It wasn't unique to her. It's the predictable outcome of an environment of whiteness where silence has been the norm.
Right. Although the fact that she said it, that she performed in that way.
Yes.
As opposed to, there are a lot of, white women, not white women, who would, the response to the Black male body, right, can often be, or the male body, we could say, within the Black male body, a different situation, can be one of fear, and I'm gonna, saying stuff, but she was so calculated, that was sort of remarkable, just the way she performed sort of her anxiety. And
certainly, I mean, when you talk about implicit bias, right, we often talk about how that operates reflexively, sort of automatically, that it may be that someone really doesn't understand that they're doing it. She really understood. She
understood.
Right? Yeah. She purposely mobilized it. I mean, she was, I assume that most people or everyone on this call has seen the video, but to me, the heart of the matter, the crux of the thing is when she says, he wants her to, they're in Central Park. Her dog is unleashed. It should be leashed. There's signs that say it should be leashed. He's a birder, and he says, "Can you please leash your dog?" She won't do it. And then he starts recording. She gets upset, and she says, "I'm going to call the police and tell them an African American man is threatening me." Yes. Right. Yes. And it's important to watch the video actually and to understand the tone. But it's not just about the words. It's the tone, and she's clearly saying she's lobbing a threat at him. Yes. Right? Because she's not only understands that a white woman who's in the wrong, right, can sort of call the police into the situation against a Black man who's in the right, but she understands that he understands what she means. That's when right. He offers that, right? Right. And when the 911 operator picks up, she tone switches again, and suddenly she's the panicky, fragile white woman. And of course, we just need to name it because it's true. And our kids need to learn this too. She is drawing out historical predecessors that lead to lynching, right? Emmett Till and Carolyn, the white woman who, I was just reading again about this. Anyway, Emmett Till's the white woman in the war, right? Yeah. Who ends up, Emmett Till ends up lynched because she claims her story kept changing. But, this is also a real life. It's not only the real reality of police do end up showing up and harming or killing Black people, it's also drawing into a historical reality that gets played out over and over again when white women, claim assault and Black men end up dead.
Right. Yeah. So Jen, you suggested in your article that parents show the video to their kids, and we certainly did as well, and had a good conversation around it. And I'm wondering how that went for you.
Yeah. So my children I showed them the video and I asked them what they thought was going on. And they first kept saying, so he's not doing anything to her. Why is she saying, she's lying. And then I said, yeah, and did you notice what she said she was going to do and what she then did do? And they said, yeah, she said, it's an African-American man. I said, why, what was that about? And my kids said, well, she was being racist and she was hoping the police would come be racist with her. They said,
let me interrupt you very quickly with a few questions about how old your children are.
Oh, thank you. So my children are 9 and 11. And what's important to the context for me sharing this conversation is that it's not the first one we've had, right? So a child, if you got a white kid or a child of any color, but this is more common in white families that you've had no conversations about this, and you showed that and you asked that question, your child might be like, well, why is she doing that? So my kids, we've talked about these kinds of matters their entire lives. So they have more context. I also, though, I try hard to begin still knowing that, just asking lots of questions and not sort of lecturing at them about, here's what you're seeing in this video, and just like ask. And so we can explore together, which helps me both partner with them, but also find out what they do and don't understand, so I can keep revisiting. So, you know, they also observed and said that things like they were aware that if he had not taped, that nobody probably would have believed him. They knew. They said it's a good thing he taped that, because, you know, that's the only way people would have believed him if he had said, I really wasn't threatening her, right? So they understood the power dynamics with the videotaping. And then I asked them, you know, so what would you do if you were there? I try and often ask my kids that question in stories and experiences that make sense to ask that, because I think we need to activate our kids' moral imagination so they practice, what would I embody if I had been in this moment? And of course they both were like, I don't know, I would have probably called you, which of course makes sense, right? Because that would have been a really overwhelming experience for a 9-year-old, right? So that, you know, and I said, yeah, that would actually make sense. That wouldn't, but then we talked about, okay, but let's say at the very least, if you were in a situation like that, a white person needs to stay. If the police are coming, a white person should stay, right? And they were like, oh yeah, because if you stayed, then you could make sure that you could also say, I know, I saw. And so we talked a little bit about how white skin can sometimes, that privilege, that unjust privilege, can be used in support in moments of crisis to kind of create a little bit of insulation for Black and brown people. So that was the conversation that we had. They were really...
That is wonderful, Jen. And as you say, you've been having these conversations for a long time. Your children are old enough and you've built enough of a scaffolding that they can have a more sophisticated conversation than perhaps many 9 and 11-year-olds might be able to have, but also certainly more than a 4 or 5-year-old might have.
Right.
Unfortunately, we've had lots of examples like this and others that we can draw on. You had such examples more or less when your children were 3 and 4.
Yeah.
You have folks who are wondering, what about younger children? What about perhaps even older children? Let's say the ages of your children who haven't had that scaffolding. Let me go back to 4 or 5 years ago with your children. If your children are 4 or 5 years younger than they are, what difference might that make? Would you still be engaging them with that video, a 5-year-old? And what kind of conversation or what different questions might you ask?
I don't know. And if folks, I'd be curious if other folks with kids that young, I wouldn't be afraid to show a 4-year-old that video. I mean, I don't show my kids graphic videos of people being killed, just to be very clear, because we've got all these videos, right? But that video, I'd probably still allow a 4-year-old to see it. I don't know if we could talk about it. When my kids were that young, I was doing things like saying, we're gonna go be with people tonight because a young Black teenager was hurt by police, and people want the government to make this stop. They want all people to be safe, and sometimes Black people are not safe. So we're gonna go be with other people who also believe everyone should be safe, and that's why we're going to this space. And I would take my kids knowing, kind of hoping that they weren't quite listening closely enough to actually hear that someone had been killed. I did sort of fib that, right? But do with that what I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I didn't. But I also kind of think our kids, at least my children, will often absorb what they're intellectually more ready to handle. And so I was doing things like that, talking about, oh my gosh, this really hard thing happened in the news today. Someone was unfairly treated because they're Black, and people who are also Black and some white people who care about that are standing up to say no, that kind of language. And so I would say that's how I started when my kids were younger. And they would then show me. One of the most amazing things that happened was when my kids were like, I think at 2 and 4 or 3 and 5, it's all kind of either after Trayvon Martin had been murdered, or it might've been after Michael Brown was murdered. I think it was Trayvon Martin, but it's,
Yeah.
My kid, I took them to a protest. I said what I just said about someone had been hurt, someone who was Black, a young Black man. And my 5-year-old ish said to me, what she heard was, and we were at the rally, she started saying, Black people aren't safe. And I said, yeah, that's right. They're not. And then she said, so this will make white parents squirmy because we were in public when she said this, she yelled, but we're white, so we are safe. And I was like, okay. And I kind of leaned down and I said, you're right, that's true, but let's talk about that in a little bit. And because I didn't want her to cause harm to people who were grieving and outraged, but I also was like, oh, she's noticing white privilege, right? And so then when we went to the car, I said, hey, you noticed something amazing. And you remember how you said Black people aren't safe? She said, yes. I said, remember how you noticed and said, we're white, so we're safe? And she said, yes. And I said, that's exactly why we were there. We want everybody to be safe, don't we? And she was like, well, of course. We want everybody to be safe. Boom, that's a 5-year-old conversation about white privilege. And we didn't even use those words. So I would say, if your kids are older and you haven't built that scaffolding, you can still start though, right with that Amy Cooper video and just say, what do you think's going on? And I realize we haven't talked about this much yet. You don't have to start all the way at the 4-year-old level, but you do just need to say, we haven't been talking, I've not really talked to you about this, and we actually need to start talking about it. So I want to tell you what I see, and let's talk about what you're wondering about, and just start right there. Wherever you at, you just need to start. And just have, you don't have to get it right. You just have to have the courage to start.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wonder also about, so we have got a lot of questions from so many registrants that we have, and people can also put questions in the Q&A, just reminding people.
And are doing that. Yep.
And are doing that. So that's great. But I also, when you talk about how we shouldn't distance ourselves from Amy Cooper, and there was someone who wrote a question about how can we not be the non-white Amy Cooper, right? Suggest that actually it's even bigger than that, right? Because it's not simply, in this case, it was weaponizing sort of white privilege, but the systems are so complex and the biases are so complex. And I wonder about with your kids, when you talk about recognizing our own biases, when we do that in front of them, or just even sympathizing, like, ooh, we've all got this work to do. I wonder if that's a conversation that you've had with your kids, because I do think that kids recognize very early, like, who's more popular, or who might get excluded because of how they act or what they look like, or even preschool, who's chosen. And there's sort of ways in asking those questions that we've certainly had those conversations with our kids, that we can talk about, have you ever done that? So I'm sort of coming to the and I've done that, to the, are we Amy Cooper?
Mm-hmm. And probably not necessarily adding any more clarity, just to reinforce what Melissa said, right? It seems, and we've had version of this question come up, sort of a bit of concern that when we focus so much, right, when we had these sort of spectacular things like Amy Cooper, like George Floyd's death, that we risk, in effect, as it were, disappearing the myriad ways in which, right, discrimination and bias shows up.
Yeah.
Because like, oh, we're not that, but, and especially for our children, who might miss, again, the more subtle but nevertheless important ways. So, what are some ways, right? Is this fair?
Yeah.
What are some ways, for example, in talking to your children, what are some ways in which, right, you might show to them smaller but important ways that their own or your own or other people's own biases may show up, at school, that they can recognize?
Yeah. It might be a hard question, but I find that's the hardest thing to do, is to just speak super honestly and the most necessary about our own biases, in front of our kids and theirs.
Yeah. I think there's a couple things come to mind, and one, and the question even just makes me think about, in a helpful way, areas of growth in my own parenting, because I don't think I ask my kids often about the possibilities and the ways that they may have showed bias, other than, of course, asking about and interrupting sort of when I hear language of meanness around any kind of, and sort of, we notice. Yep. We talk about like words like fat and how that gets thrown around a lot in our culture, and how, and sort of observations people make that are negative about people's bodies. We do talk about that. My kids are being raised by 2 moms, so we certainly talk about different families and the way different families get described as better than other families, and whether or not that happens. And I definitely have taught my kids, and I will tell my kids stories about when I showed, like exclusionary behaviors as a child, and like I tell my kids most of my dirty laundry around behaviors I had as a child, and things and ways that I've learned, and people have held me accountable. I have not done as much asking my kids, unless something was flagging for me, like, would you ever do that? Have you ever done that? In part because I do worry about, I guess there's 2 things I want to say. One, it's absolutely true. It needs to be well beyond just these spectacular moments. This is like everyday work, right? What's going on at school? What's going on in your friend group? What do you do when your friend is excluding someone? It's everyday kind of discourse. So I love that, making sure it's not just about these like big, like, oh, we got to not be that. Mm-hmm. But I also would say, for me, I worry a little bit about how pointed my questions might get, in part because of the work I do. So my kids are hyper aware that this is my work. And so I worry about them performing perfection for me around racial justice. I want them to, so I would struggle a little, I think, to, be like, so have you ever done this? Because they would hear it in a particular way because of who I am in the world, I think. Mm-hmm. But I do think asking lots of open-ended questions all the time about dynamics in friendships. Why do you think that kid might be popular? Those kinds of conversations, especially if we're helping our kids notice systems and patterns, is really, really important around all kinds of issues. But I think race for race tends to be the hardest piece for white parents to bring in. Mm-hmm. Parents have a much easier time, white parents, talking about lesbian families than talking about race with their kids. And I find that over and over, which doesn't make it more urgent. But for some reason, I really do believe that is just, there's a deeper silence there for white parents and white adults that shows up than some of the other forms of exclusion and bias.
Right.
We've already started going to the questions, and we'll keep with the questions that you're sending, both in registration and in the Q&A. Feel free to keep doing that. Of course, we won't get to most of them, but we're trying to pull together some clusters of questions. And one of them, Jen, is around, are you there? Oh, I'm afraid Jen may be frozen again.
But to Jen's point about a lot of white families having a hard time, hopefully she'll come back on, having a hard time having these conversations or just even starting. I see that a lot in questions that were asked, like, oh, but what about this? But what about that? But what about, like, as though you need to know every detail of a content, have everything confirmed before you try something. And it reminded me of, I have a lot of reluctance around, I'm a city person, we're both city people, and we moved to this place where everyone has a garden. And I have so much reluctance around gardening, and I'm just like watching videos about like worms and compost and till, all this stuff. And in looking at books and asking people, and then I just come home and I'm really overwhelmed. That's me in cooking as well. And you've gotten a lot of information, but you haven't acted. And to some extent, I think you really have to just start asking questions, and I loved the way Jen said, you can start with, we haven't really talked about this before, but I wonder, how you feel. And there are a lot of great books as well, that we have a lot of great books on our website.
Yeah, the question is, hopefully Jen will join us in a moment. The question I was going to go with, which lots of you are asking about, is about how teachers can do this work, which of course is a critical question. The school being obviously a crucial ground, not only because kids are spending a lot of time there, but because very often schools are the only place where children encounter, certainly the most significant place where children encounter real difference, right? Whether you're talking about, race or really almost any identity except maybe gender, kids are likely to find in school in a way they may not find at home. And at the same time, we recognize it is a real challenge. Oh, there's Jen.
I think my internet, I'm so sorry. I think my internet conked out for a minute.
Okay.
No, it's good to have
So
you.
I hope you all hung in there. Here we are. I just
We hung in, and it's good to have you back. And actually, I was just lining up the next cluster of questions, which was,
Great.
how can teachers support this work, especially if parents aren't on board, right? And that's a hugely important question, I was saying, not only because kids spend a lot of time in school, of course,
Yes.
but because it's also the place, far more than the home, where they're likely to encounter differences, right? Where you know, whether it's racial, class differences, religious differences, whatever the identity line might be. And at the same time, even teachers who really want to do the right thing, who are, putting on the extra work of figuring out what it looks like in their curriculum, also have a constituency of parents,
Yes.
typically, right, or guardians or grandparents or whoever it is, 30, 40 of them, some of whom may not, right, be supportive of the work they may try to do. Anyway, I imagine that you're engaged.
Many of whom.
So any words of wisdom then for the educators, let's say elementary school or even early childhood, who want to do this work but fear opposition?
Yes. So I guess the adjacent clear mandate is to all of us who are parents. We've got to be vocal advocates in our schools to have teachers' backs, because that power dynamic is very intense for teachers. Yeah. And they get, with all the challenges around teacher education, teachers have parents, they have administration, and they have these curricular demands that are also usually not adequate. That, so it's a big ask for teachers. So I really want to honor the work teachers do. So those of us that are parents, you got to get in there and advocate and support them. I would say in a situation where that's not happening, where teachers, don't have parent buy-in or don't have enough, some vocal parent buy-in, at least finding ways to ally with one another, like to try and figure out who in my building is on board with some of this. Can I create, we need to link arms with each other in the spaces we're in, because we are often in institutional spaces where we are we might feel like, or we might be the minority perspective in terms of growing anti-racism. We've got to look around and say, who's sort of on that continuum that I might form some partnerships with, so we can be a little bit strategic in moving a needle that is very difficult to move just by yourself, especially in systems that have a lot of stakeholders competing. But the other thing I would say to teachers is that the language that I feel like I would defer to as a teacher, I mean, I am a teacher, but I have a different kind of insulation because I'm in a college, is, look, my job as a teacher is to teach everybody. And so if I'm not teaching in this way, you're asking me to throw some kids under the bus. Like, that's the truth. And so if teachers can find ways in the most hostile or challenging environments to frame it as, this is my moral obligation as an educator to teach everybody, that requires that we are doing anti-racist approaches to education. And sometimes maybe like saying, as an expert in education, this is my job. It's my mantle to make sure every student is included. And that means teaching everybody's history. It means, teaching, the humanization of all people. That language might be helpful, but we really need allies. We need to build a network of people who have our back, because it is really difficult.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question from Christine, who asks, how do you deal with close friends, family that are implicitly biased around your white child, i.e. joking, making uninformed comments, etc.? How do you talk to your kids about the Amy Coopers hiding in plain sight around you?
So that's such an important question, because white families is where a lot of this festers. I try and remind myself that my audience, and I said this in the CNN piece actually, the folks that joke or do whatever they do, whatever the continuum is, if I start telling myself I need to engage them because I need to win them over, and then I see that that's not going to happen, I get tempted to not challenge them. When I remember I am modeling something for my child, a behavior that I want them to emulate, then I go, oh, there's no question I have to engage them in some way, even if I totally screw it up, right? And so I name it. And it's anything from, wow, I'm really uncomfortable with what you just said. Seemed a little racist to me. Like, that's all I got. I don't have to win the argument. I can just say that models for my child that the behavior that we want at minimum is nope. And then I also, and we certainly have family, you know, I don't want to out my whole family, but we've had a lot of struggle, especially since 2016. And so we talk about that with our kids and say, you know what, you might hear these things and you are allowed to challenge authority in these. You're allowed to challenge authority. You're allowed to tell X family member, this is what I believe. And just because it's an adult saying it doesn't mean they are correct. Mm-hmm. And so we don't also expect them to only be the ones to do that. We also have to do it too, right? But I have found actually some of the most transformative racial justice change in our family network has come actually because my people in my family who love my kids actually listen to them more than they will listen to me. And there's been some change that has come by way of my kids saying, you know what? I actually believe someone fleeing war or trying to feed their kids should cross a border, even if it's illegal. That's what I believe in, is feeding your family. And relatives going, oh, but if they hear it from me or my partner, it's like, well, you liberal, you know. So we need to tell our kids it's okay to disagree, and we have to model that.
You know, we have, you know, there are a lot of parents, right, for whom the baseline is we want children who minimally do no harm, right, whatever that exactly looks like. And then we have parents, including our guardians and teachers, including some folks asking questions here who wonder, how can we do more than that, right? How can we have, and you've given some answers, including, you know, from the discussion about how you engage your kids on the Cooper's tape, that get at, yeah, how do we, you know, raise white children in particular who will be allies to children who aren't white, who will recognize their own privilege, who will be active anti-racist, which I believe is your work. Can you give us, you know, a few tips for how to, yes, raise active anti-racists?
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about breaking silence in sort of individualistic ways, which is really, really important because that's like developmentally like the day-to-day work. But I also think parents, I mean, and this is gonna, Jen, Baptist preacher's gonna get in a pulpit for a second. Like, this country is on fire. And I do not believe this country will have a viable future if more white people don't get off the sidelines, which means not only we adults activating, but it also means raising kids who are able to be activated. And so my children this week, we know, and we've talked about who in Des Moines, where I live right now, is leading the protests right now. And here's the things we are doing to support them. And then yesterday, I took them in the car with me and we went around and we just dropped off food, takeout food, to a number of local young Black leaders who I know are exhausted and tired and outraged and grieving. And my kids were in the car and we texted to make sure it was okay. We just dropped off food. And then I said, you know what? We're just dropping off food because the folks who we love in this city are working so hard for justice. And so I think we have to take our kids into modes and spaces. So I didn't take my kids to the protests. It feels too unstable. But we did take food to people the next day. And we need to be plugged into organizations that are creating change. And we need to bring our kids along with us while we do it so that they learn not only how to do it, but they learn that we need to be doing it in multiracial ways. And they start to recognize who the leaders are where they live. My kids know who is leading in Des Moines right now, and that's important. And they see themselves as part of a community of activists, even though they're not out at the protest right now, because it does feel too unsafe to have a 9 and 11-year-old out there. But we can do other things, and so we're doing that. And so I want parents to involve their kids in that work.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I hear you, preach, you know, because yeah, I mean, that's a thing that as communities of color, you know, that we talk about is just, we can't do this alone. You know, we really are stuck if we are not, and luckily, I mean, what's great about doing this work is that we meet lots of people, including lots of white people who are really getting in there and doing the work. Jen, you had said that, that a lot of white people that you talk to sort of stop themselves from having the conversation, from doing the work. Or just are reluctant. What do you think that's about?
I think it is I think it often is about not thinking that we know what to say, being afraid we're going to say it wrong or inaccurately, or that we're going to make things worse. And to that, I really deeply believe that when we start speaking, we will hear ourselves not knowing quite what more to say, or hear ourselves not saying it as well as we wanted to, and go, oh, but I get to have the conversation again tomorrow. In the meantime, let me think about this a little more. I have had so many conversations with my kids where I left it going, wow, Jen, like it went over their head, or wow, like what was that? And then, you know, the gift of a parenting journey, not for all parents, but for most of us, is that it's long. And we get to go, you know what? I didn't love how I explained that yesterday, and I actually wanted to tell you a story. Or I found a book we could read together that explains it better. And so we are not trying to fill our kids who are empty vessels with all the accurate information. We are trying to partner with them, and they will sometimes ask the most brilliant questions. They will show us what they don't understand, and we get to try again tomorrow. And so we do not have to be right or perfect. We just have to be brave. We just have to start.
You just have to be brave.
We just have to start and be brave.
Just like in the garden, right? When you were off, I used a gardening metaphor, how I hesitate to garden. And I just watch all the videos and read the books, and I'm like, I'm a city person, you know, and I just don't do it. Yeah. Like, I just have to do it. You just have to sort of put your shovel in the soil.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yep. I'm like, if nothing else, my kids will be further along when they're 20 than when I was 20. Like my 20s were a decade of wallowing in white guilt and feeling lost. And like my kids are already past that. Thank God. That doesn't mean they aren't going to screw up. Doesn't mean I'm not screwing up. It means they are going to already show up as better friends and better allies and partners and colleagues to people of color in the world. They already are, than I was when I was 19. And that's not because I'm perfect or right. It's because we've just been continuing to talk about it and try and figure it out together with others and in multiracial community.
Yeah.
And then just to add on to that, there's one of the hesitations or the worries, and this is something that definitely happens, is someone says, my kid is uninterested, and I can tell I'm pushing too hard to help her understand. How can I help us both, you know? And that kind of, when kids are like, oh, really?
Yeah.
Or they don't want to read the book that, you know, is heavy-handed or whatever. I mean, that certainly happens, right? That happens to us all the time. I mean, all the time. But so how do you respond to that? I mean, I think that can really stop people.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple responses. I love that question. And there's been a couple books that I got for my older child who loves to read, and she just has not wanted to. And I've been having this like, do I make her read this book? Or like, right. But I also don't want anti-racism to become the point of rebellion either. Right. And this is me just talking as a parent, not as an expert. So sometimes for me, I definitely think there's a time and a place, not like, oh, my kid's not interested, thus I don't need to ever bring this up. Mm-hmm. But there is a line around sort of making it into the constant lecture or sort of the obsession in a way that, like, we have to connect with our kids, right? If it's a lecture or a way that sort of causes further disconnection, that, you know, I don't know what that looks like in different parental relationships, but I can sometimes start to feel it with my own kids. I try and avoid that. Having said that, you know, there are times when I'm like, my kids are like, I don't really want to go be at the Surge meeting tonight. And I'm like, I know you don't really want to, but guess what? I actually don't really want to either. But I do really know that my work is to be part of helping make the world more just and safe for everybody. So we're going to go anyway. It's sort of like, you know, I don't always want to eat peas, but I make my kids eat peas, you know? So I don't think there's a one size fits all. And I think it's important to stay connected, which means it can't be like this, like didactic, like you are going to care about this, but it is also modeling. And I do have times where my kids have been uninterested in X, but I've been like, you know what, you're not interested in this book, I'm going to read it. And then lo and behold, a month later, my 11-year-old's like, you know what, maybe I'll read that book. And then we could talk about it, you know? So we also just keep modeling and doing it in our own life. And sometimes our kids will go through cycles, right?
Yeah, I think the modeling is so important, or, you know, having the conversation. Like, it doesn't have to be like Andrew and I can have a conversation and they're sort of taking in a lot, but we're not lecturing them. We're sort of back and forthing.
Oh, absolutely.
Exactly. A couple of people have actually asked how old our children are. They're 9 and 12, so very close to yours,
recently
Jamie.
12, yeah.
Recently 12. And we
Yeah.
have a few questions that are really sort of flip side of the same coin. So I'm going to put them both to you, which is, one, some ideas about how we can support kids to be upstanders in school, for example, right? Where if they say something, they can intervene in a way that's supportive as needed, but also, right, relatively safe for them. And at the same time, and I know this gets complicated, how do we do that? How do we, show them, prepare them, support them to do that, while also, as Lori says, teaching our children to have empathy for a person who makes a mistake, not just engaging in blaming and shaming?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That actually, the second part of that question is one of the reasons that, and like the fear we get where we don't speak because we're afraid we're going to get it wrong. It's actually also, I didn't think to say this, but I've thought about this and talked about it in other places, that's actually important to actually speak anyway and get it wrong, because then we actually get to model the humility of saying to my kid, I didn't describe that well at all. Like, and one of the truths of anti-racism is the ability to make a mistake and be humble about that and learn. So that's another reason not to let the fear stop us, because it's okay if we make a mistake as long as we return to it. And so I think we partly help our kids do that by modeling that too, modeling humility, telling them that we've made mistakes, showing when we've learned something new, when our language has changed around something. The question about empathy and being an upstanding, I think that's a point in which, like, okay, we show the Amy Cooper video, I asked them what they're going to do. That was kind of a far out question for them in that context. But all the time our kids are hearing racist things at school and on the playground. And so when my kids were much younger, and we still do this, but much younger, so some of our earliest conversations were me sharing things I'd heard parents share about what had happened to their 4-year-old, their 5-year-old, their 6-year-old at school, and saying, what do you think was going on in this situation? And what do you think you would, what would you want to do? Or what do you think you should do if that happened and you were there? And those real life, same age kind of scenarios that happen all the time, partnering with our kids and exploring what a moral response, an upstanding moral response would be, is really great conversation fodder. And it helps them think about it. It also helps them know, hopefully if you do it with humility as an adult, that if they experience it and they don't say something or they don't know what to say, they can ask you, like, oh God, this thing happened and I didn't do that. What should I have done? Like, a lot of this is about just keeping the conversation going. And it also helps us then also understand what they do and don't yet quite understand in the way we want them to. It gives us lots of information when we ask our kids those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I've certainly talked to them about a microaggression or two that I've committed.
Yeah, yeah.
And those are good. I mean, that can also undercut the possibility of the child feeling shamed or blamed. Is
Yes.
Again, just that, like you said, humility.
Yeah.
So there was a question about co-parenting and co-parenting when, this might be a tough question, but co-parenting when your co-parent and you live separately is not so into social justice or doesn't see white supremacy, that we're the way you might. Do you have any advice on that?
And to be clear, your co-parent doesn't need to be, living somewhere else for that to be true.
Right.
It's often true with couples who are under the same roof.
Right. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and that can be really, really painful and difficult. I think, I think different contexts vary depending on the intensity of the relationship itself, especially in like a situation of separation or divorce, or that depending on how much hostility or there may or may not be. So I want to be cautious, but I do think, I in some ways the principles stand around helping our kids know by what we do with them, that even if they're getting counter messages from a co-parent, but those of us who are not co-parenting with someone where they're getting those messages, our kids are getting them from all kinds of places too, that there's not really a problem, that color blindness is a thing, that people of color shouldn't be, resisting the way they are, whatever it is. And so in some ways, I think it's the same thing, only in a more extreme situation, a more difficult situation, where we still stay in our truth, model what we need to model, tell them the honest, tell them the truth. And even if it means they experience being conflicted and challenged because they're getting two different messages, the job, I think, especially when they're in our care and when they're young, is not to convince them that we are right. It's to model so that as they come into their own, there's lots of things we can't control. But what I hope is that my kids will, as they make choices about their own values, they'll be able to look around and go, oh, these are the adults that I want to be like. These are the adults I trust to talk through this with me. And that we as adults can be that. And that's same for like folks who who have aunt and uncle relationships, right? Who might maybe have a close relationship with a child who is in a home where the racial teaching is very different. The point is there's lots of things you can't intervene in, but you can still model and show in ways that help that child as they age go, oh, but there is that aunt over there who has a different way of talking about this. And kids also have their own moral conscience too, that will show up, and they will seek out the adults that are askable and who are modeling the values that they are coming into. So, but I acknowledge that's really difficult and really painful.
Jen, thank you. And, we're at time. I want to go back actually to a thing you said that I mentioned before, just before we came on, when you said we could be at a revolutionary moment, right? It's a very difficult moment, but it's one that spurred such a significant group of people, large number of people, including many whites, certainly not exclusively whites, but many whites, I think, who are thinking, we can't, the sideline has disappeared altogether. If it ever existed, it's not there now, and if it's there now, I'm not comfortable standing on it, right?
Yes.
And again, 9,000 people here, but it's not just Embrace Race in different ways. The various folks that we consider fellow travelers in this work, right, also telling us about much more attention coming their way, many more people looking to engage. Yeah. Some of those people have asked us how they can help. I want to mention just a few things in closing. One, we know a lot of you who are listening, a lot of people who registered are new to this community. The first thing I want to say is, please stay engaged, stay with it, right? It's wonderful that, this was an occasion perhaps for you to take up this work, to look to learn more, wonder what you can do. But if you're not doing this work in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, it will have gone for nothing. And we are trying to build a community. We really want to support you and us and Jen, and have Jen get support from Jen, to have us support each other to do this work. So please stay with us. If you're not on our email list, certainly please get on that email list. Second thing, frankly, donate, right? We provide everything that we do, including this program, for free to registrants, but of course it's not free to produce. And more importantly, perhaps, there's so much more work we can do, and so many partners. Jen, I'm looking at you. So many partners we are planning work with, and it will take money to really propel that work.
Obviously,
so
if you can.
If you can, please do. If you think other people might be able to.
We want to also have people pay for people who can't pay, right? That's the point of making it accessible. So when we do have money, we give. Yeah.
And the third and last thing I want to say, this of course is a larger thing. Do something, right? There's so many things to be done. Jen, you mentioned a number of them. We mentioned we have lots of things on our website. Other people have things. There are groups, right? If you're especially concerned about police and policing the relationship with communities of color, so many groups doing amazing work and have been for a long time. Working with your children, of course, the theme of this show. There are so many things. Please do something, make a commitment, hold yourself accountable for continuing to routinely staying in the game.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jen. Next time you're on, Facebook will work, and Facebook Live will work, and we'll get all the folks on. We have another webinar coming on Friday. Andrew mentioned I Still Can't Breathe, supporting kids of color amid racialized violence. And one of our favorites, Dr. Alison Briscoe-Smith, will be on. So try to make that one. And we always publish our webinars on our website after, the day after, and the transcript the week after. So
Jen, it was wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.
We got to meet in person.
Thanks for having me. Can I just say, and also white parents should sit in on those webinars too. We need to learn more about how families of color are talking to their kids and what we need that learning too. So we all need, white folks for that one. Thank you so much.
In the 13th hour of work today, Jen.
I know.
Go hug my kid.
No. Okay.
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much, everyone.
Take care. Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.